Of course, it's a great pleasure to introduce and welcome our speaker today, Dr. Ramzy Baroud, who will be delivering this year's Hisham Sharabi Memorial Lecture. This is one of the lectures that we do. We have two annual memorial lectures, the other one being the Edward Said Memorial Lecture. And it's a great honor for us to have Dr. Ramzy Baroud here for delivering this one. So thank you, Dr. Ramzy. We appreciate it. And his talk today is going to be titled Popular Resistance, Reclaiming the Narrative and Recreating the Self. Dr. Baroud's delivery of this year's Hisham Sharabi lecture will address the necessity of re-articulating the Palestinian narrative based on the aspirations of the Palestinian people. He reminds us that they are the protagonists of the Palestinian story, the victims of oppression, and the main channel of resistance, starting with the creation of Israel on the ruins of Palestinian towns and villages in 1948. In his own words, if Palestinians hadn't resisted, their story would have concluded right there and then, and they too would have disappeared. Those who admonish Palestinian resistance, armed or otherwise, have little understanding of the psychological ramifications of resistance, such as a sense of collective empowerment and hope among the people. And for 70 years, Palestinians resisted, and the resistance in all forms molded a sense of collective unity, despite the numerous divides that have been erected among them. A new articulation of the Palestinian narrative is necessary now more than ever before. The elitist interpretation of Palestine has failed and is as worthless as the Oslo Accords. It is no more than a tired exercise in empty cliches aimed at sustaining American political dominance in Palestine as well as in the rest of the Middle East. It is only when the Palestinian intellectual, guided by the resistance of her or his people, is able to repossess that collective narrative that the confines placed on the Palestinian voice can be finally broken. Only then can Palestinians truly confront the Israeli Hasbara and the U.S. Western corporate media propaganda, and at long last speak unhindered. So for those of you who don't know Dr. Ramzy Baroud, he is an U.S. Arab journalist, media consultant, and author. He's an internationally syndicated columnist and editor of the Palestine Chronicle since 1999. He's the former managing editor of London-based Middle East Eye from 2014 to 2015. He's the former editor-in-chief of the Brunei Times and former deputy managing editor of Al Jazeera Online. He taught mass communication at Australia's Curtin University of Technology, the Malaysia campus. Dr. Baroud also served as head of Al Jazeera English Research and Studies Department. He's a contributor to many books and the author of 3, including My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, Gaza's Untold Story, and his books have been translated into French, Turkish, Arabic, Korean, among other languages. And just to let you all know, we do have some copies of his latest book, which is called The Last Earth, A Palestinian Story, and those will be available for purchase after he's finished with his talk. Over here we'll have them for sale for $20. And I think if we have enough time, he might be able to sign some, but he is actually has to catch a flight, so he'll be in a rush. Dr. Baroud has a PhD in Palestine Studies from the European Center for Palestinian Studies at the University of Exeter, and is a non-resident scholar at Orphalia Center for Global and International Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Baroud will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A session. Again, because he is in a rush, he needs to get to a flight, we ask that you please keep your questions very brief and to the point so that everybody has a chance to ask him questions. We also ask that you wait for the mic to come to you before you ask anything so everybody online can hear. And for our online audience, you can tweet your questions to us at Palestine Center. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Ramzy Baroud.
Thank you very much, Muhammad, for that lovely introduction. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here at the Jerusalem Fund at the Palestine Center to give the memorial lecture, the Hisham Sharabi Memorial Lecture. Hisham Sharabi is one of those individuals that greatly influenced my generation, like Edward Said and others. So to be standing here to give this particular lecture gives me great honor and great pride. I'm also grateful for all of you who came today. It's lovely to finally assign faces to some of the names. I've known some of you for years. I've known about some of you through television and other mediums, and to be speaking here with you and or to you, it's a great honor and pleasure. Before I start, let me try to situate my talk in kind of proper parameters. I believe in a version of history that is known as history from below, people's history. It's not a sentimental form of history. It's not the kind of history that we need to know because we feel that there is this kind of sense of obligation towards the people as a random value that doesn't really have any defined political structure. To the contrary, I argue that the people, the Palestinian people in this case, are very fundamental to our understanding of the Palestinian discourse and our understanding of the so-called conflict in the Middle East. The way that Palestinians have been perceived throughout the years, a perception that kind of depends on who is defining the Palestinian people. If you are pro-Palestine, then you see Palestinians largely as victims of Israeli colonialism, oppression, American imperialism, however you wish to define it. And if you are pro-Israel, you see Palestinians as a perpetual violent creature, a terrorist even. So this discourse, or rather these two competing discourses in which Palestinians are perceived as a perpetual victim or a perpetual terrorist, kind of in a way did a great deal of unfairness to the Palestinian people. Actually, if you think about it from a historical point of view, political consciousness among the collective people of Palestine goes back to 100 years and more. In fact, some people would even argue that it goes back to the 17th century and during that period where there was a sense of a collective Palestinian identity with cities like Akka, for example, Akko, and others kind of rose against the Ottomans and rose against various powers that were competing over Palestine. There was a sense of the people of that region knew who they were, and they were a political entity that acted with a clear sense of political empowerment. So in some way, believe it or not, the Palestinian people did not exist the moment that the Zionists decided for us to exist. We actually have existed long time, and I mean as political entities, long time before the Zionist movement began being formulated towards the middle and end of the 19th century, when they were still kind of really torn. Should it be Uganda? Should it be Patagonia and Argentina? Should it be Palestine? Or should it be somewhere else? When they were still going through that process, we knew exactly who we were as a people. We defined exactly who we were as a people, and we have already been through so many battles against invaders and colonialists. And I'm sure that many of you already know that the city of Jericho have existed for about 11,000 years. So when Newt Gingrich, for example, comes and says the Palestinians are an invented people, kind of, trying to pay some, his dues to Sheldon Adelson and and others, what essentially he is saying, he is kind of really playing this broken Zionist record that's been going on for such a long time. There is this deep insecurity that Zionists have. They know what they have done was absolutely horrific. And they know that they could have never achieved their objectives without using violence at this kind of the terrible scale that was used against the Palestinian people. And they cannot sustain their projects without using violence as well. Extreme forms of violence. We know what just happened in Gaza. 27 people were killed, 200 people were injured in the latest Israeli onslaught. The Great March of Return, this non-violent form of popular struggle that has been happening at the fence, separating Gaza, besieged Gaza from apartheid Israel. They killed over 250 people. They wounded over 17,000 people. About 6,000 of them are maimed, permanently disabled. None of these kids at the border and none of these families at the fence, rather, have been employing any form of armed resistance whatsoever. Yet the Israeli Zionist response was the exact same response that they have exhibited against Palestinians who are fighting with their arms in the recent onslaught. So the Israeli Zionist project can only happen through can only be sustained through violence and extreme violence. There is, as I said, there is this deep insecurity that Zionists have. When Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, comes and says, BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movements, they are trying to delegitimize the state of Israel. Of course, he's right. I mean, for once, he's not actually lying. That's precisely what we are trying to do. But we are trying to do so not to delegitimize Israel as in the way that they are portraying us to be. We are trying to delegitimize the Jewish people. We have absolutely no quarrel with the Jewish people as people. In fact, many members of our movements, everywhere you go, are themselves Jewish activists. But we are trying to delegitimize Israel as an apartheid state, as a colonial power, as a military occupier that has no business being a colonized power and a military occupier that violates international law with impunity every single day. That's exactly what we are trying to delegitimize. But this deep insecurity within the Zionists is like when you do something wrong, something terribly wrong, there is something, seeing the victim every single day, it's kind of this reminder of these awful things that you have done. And these kids who are gathering right now as we speak at the border, at the fence between Gaza and Israel, is this kind of reminder. The Palestinians are still there. And as long as the Palestinians are still there, as long as the Zionist project is not complete. And that's a problem for Israel. It's a very serious problem. Their problem is actually not with the Palestinian leadership. I'm sure that a lot of you don't find that surprising at all. In many ways, the Palestinian leadership, at least since the signing of Oslo in '93, have in a way become almost like a buffer between Israel and the Palestinian people. And let me tell you why this is important. As we all of us have many opinions about what's happening in the Arab world. Do you want to call it an Arab Spring? I don't like the term because it's very much a Western term. It's a kind of terminology, whenever something used to happen in Europe against, or Eastern Europe against some communist government, they always assign the word spring to it. So when they assigned the word spring, I went back and I started trying to find out, where is this coming from? And unlike common wisdom that it was the foreign Foreign Policy magazine that coined the term. It wasn't actually Foreign Policy magazine in 2011 that coined the term. It was the neocons that coined the term, and they coined it during the American invasion of Iraq. Because they argued that the American invasion of Iraq is going to bring a form of democracy, and this could bring an Arab Spring of democracy, right? So when they said Arab Spring in Tunisia, my heart started pounding very hard. It's like, God helps us, what is going on? But in reality, despite the US trying to kind of manipulate and use these revolts and this upheaval to its advantage, in many ways, these revolts were in fact genuine. They were genuine in the sense that since Sykes-Picot was signed in 1916, since the French and the British colonial powers got together with some tacit support from the Russians, and they signed an agreement in which they divided most of the Middle East amongst themselves, the Arab people became a non-factor. They were there. They were just there. They were there to be oppressed, to be manipulated, to be marginalized, but they were no longer really an element or a factor in an equation of how the Middle East is ruled. Who ruled the Middle East? Colonial powers and eventually neo-colonial powers and corrupt Arab regimes. Elites of various sorts, tribal at times, military coup leaders at times, and so forth and so on. In 2011, something fundamental happened. There was a major shift in which the people are suddenly a factor. Now, that doesn't mean just because the people became a factor in an equation that was always confined to the colonial powers and the Arab regimes, it doesn't mean that that solves anything. It just means that finally, someone is challenging this paradigm. Finally, there is some movement. And it's tragic what is happening in most of Arab countries. We know what happened in Syria, of course. Libya is more or less a failed state. Yemen is more or less a failed state. And that's because these traditional powers that controlled the Middle East for all of those years have been trying to kind of get back to the status quo. They wanted to recreate the status quo. They don't want some average Abdullah and average Muhammad and Fatima in Egypt and Yemen and Libya to determine anything. They have to be pushed back. They have to be suppressed. This is why the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris and the Turks and the traditional elites of the Middle East, with the help of colonial powers, mostly the United States, but also other European powers, the French in particular, the Italians as well in Libya, have been very much involved in trying to take us back to some new Middle East. You know where the term comes from, Condoleezza Rice, right? The new Middle East, that was after the Iraq War. They want to take us back to that new era, and they want a new contract between these corrupt regimes in order for the people to be pushed back to where they belong. And of course, it's problematic, and this is where my sense of hope comes, that despite all of this, all of what is happening right now, we know that finally someone is challenging the old paradigm. And I think this is, I describe it as a sandstorm. I don't know if any of you have been caught in a sandstorm, but I have. And the thing about sandstorms are very interesting, that once there's a sandstorm, don't try to stand there and be a hero. Just put your head down and try to cover your eyes. But once the sandstorm is over, there is a whole new landscape. The sand dunes that were over there are over here. The large one is now a tiny one, and so forth and so on. And I think we are going through this massive sandstorm. And I'm not trying to be Orientalist in my description of the sandstorm in the Middle East, but it's really the only metaphor I can think of at the moment. But when you think about it, the Palestinian people, between Sykes-Picot until today, have never, despite of everything, have always remained empowered. And I think that's what makes Palestinians particularly special. In the 1920s, when the peasants revolted, the workers of Jaffa and Yafa and Haifa revolted against the British and the Zionists and organized in unions, and they fought in the orchards of Jenin and Ya'bad in the West Bank. In the 1930s, when the Palestinians launched one of the longest strike really in the history of that region, for 6 months, this consistent strike, the kind of political consciousness that Palestinians had at the time. Really, when you think of the level of education, when you think of the most of the revolutionaries were poor peasants, you know, like my grandfather and so forth, they actually managed to grasp that degree of political consciousness and to fight the British colonialists and the Zionists as well. And their strike eventually led to the Palestinian Rebellion of 1936 that lasted for 3 years. Tens of thousands of people were killed and wounded and arrested. The British hanged so many Palestinians during those years, you know. So, and yet that did not stop. It did not stop. The Nakba, the catastrophic loss of the Palestinian homeland in 1948, it was a massive shock to the collective psyche of the Palestinian people. You know, being dislocated physically, it also brings in other forms of dislocations as well. Psychologically, emotionally, culturally. To be a Palestinian living in Akka or in Safad or in Lid or somewhere else, and you find yourself trying to survive in some refugee camp in Lebanon, living on handouts in Gaza, or taking a boat and heading somewhere, not knowing where it's going to land, in Greece, in Cyprus, and so forth. You can't really try to imagine this in the regular terminology that we often use. You really have to live that experience through the words of the people who have lived it. And even then, you might not fully grasp the intensity of that experience. So there was that disruption of the momentum of the Palestinian national movement. Yet, within months, within a couple of years, there was a rise of a new movement by the refugees, the Fidaiyin movement, the freedom fighters, who found a way to organize in refugee camps and to fight back. And the Israelis responded with absolute impunity. One of my relatives back in the Baroud refugee camp. Now, Baroud, I'm mentioning the name Baroud particularly because the Great March of Return that is happening right now, one of the main central points of organization among the people of Gaza is the Baroud area, which is right at the fence separating Gaza from Israel. So to think about the fact that for 70 years, those kids in Baroud, generation after generation, they find enough spirit, enough vigor, enough courage, enough determination, enough hope that they can always go there and fight in one way or the other. I find it absolutely inspiring. One of my relatives back then, you see, most of the refugees couldn't really fully fathom the nature of the Zionist movement at the time, that this is a done deal, that the world, the Western world that was controlling initially the League of Nations, then the United Nations, they were on the side of Israel, and there was no turning back on reversing that historical occurrence. As far as most of those people were concerned, that's my house over there, that's my land over there, I just need to go there. They were so worried. Like, for example, one major issue of conflict between my grandmother and my grandfather, and it turned out, whenever I tell that story, it turned out that a lot of people say, yep, the same issue happened in my family as well, is that when they were driven out of their villages back in Palestine, they had decisions to make. Are we coming back? And if we are, then when? So my grandfather did not want to bring the blankets, the new blankets, with him. And my grandmother said, no, we have to bring the blankets because we don't know if we're going to come back or not. And he was like, what are you talking about? Of course we are going back. The Arabs are not going to let this happen. The world is not going to let this happen. And they had that conflict until they died in the 80s. On, was it the right decision not to take the old blankets or not? So there was not enough awareness yet at the time among the refugees, especially those who came from peasant societies like my family, in villages and so forth. There was not enough awareness of what is at stake and what's going to happen to us. So many of them actually tried to go back to their villages to harvest their crops. Those who were driven out in March and April and May, they needed to go there with a great sense of urgency to harvest the crops. Many of them never came back. One of my relatives in Abu Ghraib was found found dead while he was trying to pick some figs in what they call the death zone, which is what we call today the fence separating Gaza from Israel. That used to be called the death zone because it was always a bloodbath as far as the Zionists were concerned. He was killed, and then they kind of opened his guts, sorry to be too graphic here, and they actually put the figs that he was trying to collect inside of him. And that story kind of really served as maybe that was it. Maybe we can't go back. It's like the Zionists were trying to send a message. I know that my grandmother at that point stopped going back to try to steal some of their own harvest back in Palestine, and they had to stay in the refugee camp until she died. And there was another generation, my mother's generation, then my generation, and now you have a fourth generation who are protesting at the fence separating Gaza from Israel. Now, so this is the Palestinian people. We haven't been marginalized. We have never been marginalized. We stood against marginalization. We fought our own supposed leadership because of that issue. In fact, at times it feels as if we are fighting for relevance not only against the Israeli occupier, but sometimes and quite often and more recently so against the very Palestinian Authority that tries to represent us. That's the sad reality of it. In 1978, for example, the first Palestinian uprising, when we think about uprisings, a lot of people kind of talk about uprisings as if they are, it's a process in which nations are liberated. Uprisings don't liberate nations. Uprisings raise the collective consciousness of a nation to identify itself and to declare its relevance and to find its common ground and so forth. The Intifada was such an event. This is why I kind of scoff at those who say, Palestinians need to go out there for a third Intifada. It doesn't happen this way. You can't summon an Intifada. An Intifada is an organic process. An uprising is an organic process that comes from the people themselves. In 1987, when the Palestinian leadership was kicked out of Lebanon, found itself in Tunisia, in Jordan, in Yemen, and elsewhere, and Arabs I'm sure that they were grateful to see the Palestinian issue being increasingly marginalized. They were kind of happy to look past it, as we are experiencing right now. And this is why the so-called deal of the century is going to fail, because there were other attempts in the past at marginalizing the Palestinian leaderships and the Palestinian people. And every time such an event takes place, what happens is that the Palestinian people rise again. 1987 was that collective popular response to any attempt at marginalizing the Palestinian people and the Palestinian leadership. We give relevance to the Palestinian leadership. If it were not for the Intifada, the Palestinian leadership would have disappeared in Tunisia and kind of lived off their large investments in hotels and other real estate properties elsewhere. It was the Palestinian people that once more took that initiative. If you look at any period of history, the Palestinian people have always been there, and they are still here. And this is why Israel is launching its wars. This is why Israel targets Palestinian homes and schools. Just in the last war, I think, 17 schools that were either destroyed or partially destroyed. Why schools? Why are you bombing cultural centers? Why are you bombing mosques and churches? Why are you bombing homes? If indeed your fight against so-called militants, you would bomb militants' positions And that's that. But why are you targeting the institutions that belong to the Palestinian people? Because of this attempt at constantly breaking the will of the Palestinian people. This is not a fight between Israel and Hamas. It's between Israel and the Palestinian people. And it has always been that way. Even before Hamas became relevant, even before Hamas became a party in 1988. The Israeli massacres in Palestine were still there, and they were still as intense. Even when the fighters who kind of took on the mission of the armed struggle were largely socialists and communists, the Israeli response was still the same. So all of these things that we hear in the media, the Islamists and not the Islamists, and Hamas and not Hamas, is of no relevance to the conversation at all as far as Israel is concerned. So the Palestinian people have always been there. But we are stuck. We are stuck in this unfair narrative, not one that sees us as either victims or terrorists, but one that rather marginalizes entirely, as if we are not even part of this conflict. I'll tell you why. If you read Edward Said's Orientalism, you will know, and I'm sure that many of you have, that the Orientalist notions have been going on for centuries. It's not a new phenomenon. It wasn't even born with Zionism in the late 19th century. In fact, it dates back to somewhere in around the year 1300 something. We as Palestinians arrived to the scene a bit late. The story has already been fabricated by the Zionists. They have everything out there that ensure that the story is entirely located within Zionist priorities. So as Palestinians, I was talking to Muhammad earlier today. I said, my generation, when I came to this country about 25 years ago, it was Noam Chomsky and Edward Said largely, and a few others, but they kind of largely defined the Palestine viewpoint. And as a result, we needed to do what I call history by negation, as in we are constantly in a state of self-defense, constantly. We are not terrorists. We say that quite often. Not all Palestinians are terrorists. Not all Palestinians elected Hamas, for example, and so forth. Why? Because we feel that judgment is already being cast. And now we have to kind of, in a way, prove our worth, our humanity. We try to distance ourselves from what has already been a saturated discourse that exists in mainstream media, mainstream academia, and of course, across Western governments everywhere you go, of course, with the United States being kind of the heart of the beast as far as the anti-Palestinian discourse is concerned. But in the process of doing so, I fear that we ended up dehumanizing our people, because we are constantly trying to find a way to justify what is happening. And in the process of justification, I feel like we are getting lost. We rarely had the opportunity to actually stand there and tell you, this is who we are, beyond Zionism, beyond imperialism, beyond all sorts of ideological reductionism. This is who we are. And we have been there since the very beginning of time and civilization. And we are going to be there for many, many years. And no matter what Israel does or it doesn't do, it's not going to have any bearings on our existence as a people. Rarely do we actually get to tell you the stories of this lady, for example, Marwan al-Assar. Marwan al-Assar is this refugee. She is 78 years old, refugee from Al-Nusayrat refugee camp in Gaza. I interviewed Marwan and many, many other Palestinians from all over the West Bank, Gaza, Palestine 48, the Middle East region, in diaspora, in Spain. I went to Chile, in fact, to interview Palestinians. In the beginning, as I approach this, here I am like, okay, this is a very redundant discourse that doesn't actually tell the stories of our people. And I want to reclaim that. And when I say I'm not really just me, I mean, there's a large school of Palestinian intellectuals and journalists and authors and artists who are trying to do the same thing. So I wanted to reclaim part of that. So I started interviewing Palestinians and trying to think, if Palestinians are to tell their story, if I am to animate Palestinian history through the Palestinian people themselves, what would that history look like? You see? But then I approached it with the same idea that, pre-Nakba, Nakba, post-Nakba. Pre-Nakba, 1967 war, post-Nakba, first Intifada, second Intifada, Oslo, voila. Here's Palestinian history. But when I spoke to ordinary people, they don't care about these references whatsoever. Nobody is there to tell you, well, I think nonviolent resistance is the way to go as opposed to violent resistance. And nobody asked me who is the Palestinian Gandhi, which is a question everybody keeps tossing at me everywhere I go for some reason. One state, two states is of no relevance to anybody. These are people who are living their everyday life, and they are determined to live, they are determined to resist, and it comes natural to them. It's not a decision that they have made, it's a collective decision that's made on everybody's behalf. So when I spoke to Marwan, for example, Marwan had a hard time telling the difference between the 1956 war and the 1967 war. And I was thinking, okay, maybe Marwan is just not in it anymore. Maybe Marwan is not the right person to talk to. But when she started talking about her family and her children, she remembered things in absolutely vivid details. When she lost two loved ones. One is her brother Salim in 1956, and one is her son Kemal in the first Intifada, 1987. Decades existed between these two dates. But when Marwan speak about them, she kept mixing the names of Salim and Kemal. And I would say, you're talking about Kemal. Oh, yeah, son, I'm sorry. Yes, I mean Kemal. And I was like, wait a minute. Why does she keep mixing these two names, even though she has this absolutely vivid memory of everything when it comes to her family? And that's because for Marwan, grief is something that defines her discourse on Palestine. The loss of her Palestinian homeland in 1948, her village back in Palestine, which is the village of Julis, and the loss of her brother Salim in 1956 but to the Israelis who invaded Gaza briefly for a few months, and the loss of her son, who was a socialist youth organizer who was tortured repeatedly by the Israelis until he died. And because for her, the story is one and the same. There's no division. Here you find yourself in these kind of platforms where people say, expect you to forget about everything that happened before 1967. Anything between 1948 and 1967, so you are calling for the destruction of the State of Israel because you want to talk about the right of return for Palestinian refugees. That's not part of the story. Talk about 1967. That's all that matters. For Marwan, she could care less because Salim died before 1967 and Kemal died in 1987. For her, it's the same narrative, the same story, which is the same thing for all the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere. We don't demarcate our history based on what is politically convenient for Western media or for Western audiences. We don't do that, you see. Ali Abu Ghraib is a fighter. This is a very interesting man, Ali Abu Ghraib. Ali is illiterate. He can't read or write, but he pretty much fought in every war you can think of. I mean, he fought the Israelis after, fought the Israelis in the early 60s. He joined Fatah, fought the Israelis in Lebanon. He fought the in Jordan, fought the Israelis in Lebanon. He actually appeared at al-Qasrain. Who knows what is al-Qasrain? The tiny little Iraqi town in southern Iraq. And I was like, Ali, what were you doing fighting in al-Qasrain? I mean, that's not our fight. It's so far away, and this is an Arab nationalist, you see, Ali Abu Ghraib. He goes, what do you mean it's not our fight? American imperialism is our fight. And I said, well, how did you get to al-Qasrain? He was in Syria at the time. He said, the shabab, the young people came and said, we are taking buses and we are going across the border to fight the Americans. And I just jumped in, took the bus, went to al-Qasrain. Unfortunately, they actually couldn't make it all the way to the town. The Americans bombed their buses. Pretty much everybody was killed except a few. Ali Abu Ghraib was arrested, taken to Baghdad, kept there for a few months, and eventually shipped back to Lebanon, to Syria, where he was imprisoned in Syria. Eventually, Ali reappeared in Gaza after the uprising turned civil war, turned regional war, turned international war in Syria. And he was freed from his prison, made it to Lebanon. The Lebanese kicked him out, went to Egypt. The Egyptians did not want him there, but he didn't know what to do. So he was smuggled through the tunnels back to Gaza. Unfortunately, he did so without his family. Nobody knows what happened to his family. I spoke to Ali because the idea was, if I write an article about Ali and have it written in translated to French and Spanish and push it out there, maybe someone somewhere would know what happened to his family. Unfortunately, nothing came of it. But the story was so multi-layered and so fascinating, so I decided to actually include it in my last book. He actually went during the 2014 war. Now Ali is he's actually not as old as he looks. He's just tired and been injured multiple times and can barely walk. So when he went to Gaza, Hamas gave him a little trailer. It doesn't have water or electricity in the Khan Yunis area, very close actually to the Israeli, to the fence with Israel. And he just lives there with the hope that his family is going to reappear at one point. So I told him, so what happened, Ali, after you got to Gaza? He said, well, people there are very respectful of our sacrifices and all of that. And he said, but when the war started in 2014, I went to the border to fight with the fighters. Okay, I mean, what happened? He said, I just approached them. They were Hamas fighters in the Beit Hanun area. And he said, I told them I'm ready to fight. He said, but, you know, we are going to carry on with this fight. It's the same fight you have already fought for us, and thank you, ya'tik al-afiyah, but it's time for you to just wait and let us, you know, take on this one. And I said, what happened at the end? He said, well, they bought me a kebab sandwich, and they put me in a taxi, and they sent me back. But then if you really truly want to appreciate the story of the armed struggle, you have to listen to Ali Abu Ghraib. It can't be an academic discourse in which you compare numbers and fighters and look at the politicking with King Hussein and Jordan and what happened and what did not happen. You have to talk to these people in order for you to truly comprehend an authentic Palestinian discourse. If you don't mind, I'm going to read just a little excerpt from Ali's story. It's called Letters to Heba. Heba is his eldest daughter. Muhammad, can you just keep me abreast about time? Oh, okay. All right. Heba, I tried my hardest to shield you from all harm. You saw me in my heyday as a fighter, in my military fatigue, but also as a broken man who worked under the burning sun as a manual laborer. My pocket hid the secret of a fake name on a forged identity card. All the while, I was fighting for you. And I really thought we could win. I long fantasized about our final trip to Palestine, once it would be liberated. I imagined you wearing the thobe I bought you from Burj al-Barajne, embroidered with the colors of the flag. I imagined Ahmed as a fighter too, wearing a khaki outfit, adorned with a black and white kufiya. in that fantasy, I was always old, but strong enough to remember everything clearly. I would guide you through our village in Wadi al-Shalalha in Bir al-Saba. This is where your grandfather, Aish, fell in love with your grandmother, Hamda. I would say, and you would smile and insist I tell you the story all over again. And you needed to know every detail. From the color of the sky to the flowers that bloomed. He was a poor man too. A Bedouin like me. And like me, he was short, dark, and wrinkled. And you needed to know every detail. From the color of the sky to the flowers that bloomed. Sorry, repeating that. He was a poor man too, a Bedouin like me, and like me, he was short, dark, and wrinkled. But unlike me, he had little patience. His life was always hard. And when he was forced out of his village, that small piece of land we called At-Tur al-Abyad, he lost his mind. He lost everything. When I first came to Seattle from Gaza, I remember the refugee camp. I was born and raised in a refugee camp. My family comes from a destroyed village in in Palestine called Beit Daras. Beit Daras is known for several things. We make the best couscous anywhere, and we fight for that honor. Nobody can take it away from us, and we have large heads. That's the stereotype. And it's really not true at all, because when my friends at school used to say, you are Badrasawi, you have a large head. And I was like, but my head is not particularly large. But it was because we were really quite stubborn people, you know. And we fought the Israelis in 3 different battles. The last battle is known as Ma'arakat Beit Daras al-Kubra, the Great Battle of Beit Daras, and also known as the Beit Daras Massacre. Many people in the village were killed, and the rest were ethnically cleansed to Gaza mostly, but now they are everywhere. And many of them have joined various political parties and became fighters with Hamas, with Fatah, with the Communist Party. I always find it interesting that half of my family are socialists and the other half is Hamas, and I can't explain that logically. But I saw Palestine at a whole different level from the way I saw Palestine being articulated outside of Palestine. In the refugee camp, I lived beside the martyrs' graveyard, beside the great mosque that eventually became Al-Qassam Mosque, that was destroyed by Israel in 2014, and 2 people were killed and many people were wounded. Most of my neighborhood was actually gone in the bombing in 2014. So I saw Palestine as a people who are falling victim, but a people who are fighting back. The martyrs' graveyard, the constant attempt at breaking us, and the constant attempt at articulating our identity as a collective who refused to surrender and refused to be defeated. But when I went to Seattle, I joined immediately, wanted to be as close as possible to Palestine, so I joined this a Palestine solidarity group. And I thought it was really quite interesting that, number one, they did not know anything about the reality that I relate to, nothing. One of them spoke about it in this kind of mega narrative, you know, this socialist, you know, depiction of Palestine and Indochina and Vietnam and, you know, and South America and the whole anti-American imperial. So we kind of like lost somewhere. And I was like, yeah, but we are more than that. We are not just a convenient assertion you make to prove a point. But then also there was a lady who came and said, you know, you also have to think about all the poor Israeli soldiers who have to experience this, and they go back with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they have to, and nobody said anything about my neighbors and my friends, and my friend Ala, who was shot in the head when we were coming back from school, and fell in a coma for 2 years before he died, or my friend Ra'id, who was killed right on my doorsteps and was buried a few feet away in the martyrs' graveyard. That seemed to be of no relevance to anybody. And that's really, it was the moment where I decided, I was a big fan of Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States, and just that concept. I was a young kid in my early 20s at the time, but really I was fascinated by the concept of people's history. And I thought, perhaps this is the way to reclaim our narrative. And I had, without the help of so many fantastic people, I would have never been able to do my PhD on the subject or publish all my books, and to meet with so many people in so many different countries and cities to talk about it and engage with people and to challenge them to see Palestine from that viewpoint. I'm also a big fan of Antonio Gramsci and his notes from prison, and what he describes as the organic intellectual. The organic intellectual is not someone who has eloquence and the power of words. The organic intellectual is someone who is engaged and in the mobilization and engaged, and something that Edward Said also elaborated on in his definition of the public intellectual as well. Someone who can navigate that space where he doesn't feel disengaged and disconnected, uncomfortable in his little place, whether at a university or at a government think tank or whatever. An organic intellectual is someone who's out there talking to these people and trying to push their story back to the heart of the narrative. Because without the Palestinian people, there is no story to tell. There is a story that we are telling right now that happened not because of the Palestinian leadership, but despite of the Palestinian leadership. It is the Palestinian people that made our story relevant. And it's the Palestinian people who made us stand here 70 years after the fact to talk about the Palestinian people. We salute the Palestinian people, and we thank you so very much for all of your support and solidarity and for your attention.
Dr. Ramzy, thank you so much for your presentation. That was very touching, and we appreciate it. So we have some time for some questions, so we will start. Okay, we'll start here and then there.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Saeed Erekat. I'm a Palestinian journalist. My question to you, how do you see Palestinian popular resistance evolving over the next, let's say, 5 years or 10 years, now that all the political schemes are collapsing? Thank you.
Should I address each question?
Yeah, I'll
separately?
take another question.
Okay.
So you can do both of them.
Thank you very much for your remarks, encouraging. But I have a question for you. What do you think of the current attempts that's going on in the Middle East by Arab governments, Arab Gulf governments, and some Israelis of working together to establish some resolution? Does that concern you? Thank you.
Take one more question.
Yes, Ramzy, I would really like to know, from the point of view of somebody who isn't Palestinian but has been working for justice in Palestine now for 51 years, what else we can do, because this is not just a battle for Palestinian justice. It's something that all of us have to do and have to work on. So what can we do?
All right. Thanks, Mohammed. I think what is happening, Dr. Saeed, in the fence between Gaza and Israel at the moment is an interesting phenomenon. Usually, these kind of popular mobilizations take the form of uprisings. But because of the uniqueness of the Palestinian case, with Gaza being completely under siege and the West Bank is now kind of really under the control of two domineering powers, the local police, and that is the Palestinian Authority, and Israel with its militant Jewish settlers. The prospect of an intifada in the traditional sense is a bit, I think, too difficult for Palestinians, because they have attempted that and they have been crushed, sadly, by all these forces combined. But I think what is happening at the fence is far more important than just a group of people, just going there demanding the end of the siege and the right of return, because this is the kind of the media narrative. And I think, of course, there is much truth to it, but I think the collective awareness of this event is not like, so why are you going, Ramzy, to the fence? Well, I'm going there to demand the right of return. And it's much more complex than that. I think it's the people who have been deprived from the initiative, and the Palestinian people haven't been really do not accept these kind of conditions. They have always found a way to come together and articulate a discourse. And I think what's happening at the fence is precisely that. What we see in the news, the sound bites of kids, throwing rocks and setting tires on fire and sometimes shaking the fence, and Israeli snipers shooting them down one after the other. But what we rarely see is the fact that you have tens of thousands of people, at times, in certain occasions, we'll have hundreds of thousands of people being a people, dancing, having reading circles, giving lectures, mobilizing at so many different levels, even cooking. And how many weddings happened at the fence? So many weddings. A lot of people got married at the fence. It's like, if you think that you have suffocated us as a people, we will always find a way to express our humanity. Is a way to insist on living, as opposed to see yourself as a perpetual victim. And I think the Gaza phenomenon right now is absolutely incredible. And I have a feeling that it's going to have massive consequences on this generation and the future generation of Palestine. The same way that the first Intifada has influenced my generation, our language and our discourse and our ideology, I think the Great March of Return is going to have this tremendous influence on the future leadership of the Palestinian people. I have no question, there's no question in my mind about it. But I also think that there is also a rising generation outside Palestine of Palestinians in diaspora who have been kind of like marginalized. The moment you cross the border, as far as Israel is concerned, at least in the old days, is the moment that you were irrelevant. In fact, this is why they used to have us sign these documents once we leave Gaza, that we're not going to come back for 3 years or 5 years or 6 years, to ensure that you are not going to come back. And when you try to come back, they will find obstacles not to allow you back in. But I think this generation of Palestinians all over the world, and I think they are really the core of the BDS movement, the boycott movement everywhere. You see them at universities, you see them at community centers, you see them everywhere. They are also kind of taking part in that sort of popular mobilization, engaging civil society around the world, working with various indigenous groups, which is something that I think is so essential to our narrative. And I'm going to elaborate on that for a little bit. And I know, Muhammad, you're going to say, well, I'm way exceeding my time here. But this is so very important. I think one of the things that Oslo has done to us, it has dislocated us geographically as well. Back in the day, we were so keenly connected to the South. We were present everywhere in Africa, in South America, in India, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and so forth. When I went to visit South Africa the first time, I was approached by a group of old fighters, anti-apartheid, but actual freedom fighters, men who carried guns and fought the apartheid regime. And they came to thank me. And I didn't really understand, why am I being thanked here? They said, I thank you for what the PLO has done to help us. I was really quite ignorant about the history of the PLO support of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the underground armed struggle. And they showed me their military uniform that was given to them by the PLO with the PLO sign and Palestinian flag on it. You see, Oslo, what has Oslo done to us, it dislocated us from our natural alliances, the indigenous people, everywhere in the world and positioned us in London, Oslo, Madrid, Camp David, Washington, and so forth. So even though we keep arguing Oslo is dead, yes, it is. But culturally and politically, it hasn't died. We are still there. We are still stuck in London and New York and Washington and so forth. We need to escape that. And we need to go and rediscover those natural alliances we've had. And I know many Palestinians, and I'm happy to be one of them, have been trying to re-engage. In South Africa, I met with the Zulu-speaking people. I met with the representatives of the Maori people in New Zealand, with indigenous people in Australia. Recently came back from Hawaii, where I spoke with the native Hawaiian academics and leaders. And the beautiful thing about it, you never have to make a case for these people. You never have to convince them of anything. It's their story. You take the native Hawaiians out and put the Palestinians, the story is not disrupted. It's the same narrative. We need to connect with them again. And this is where I think, to answer your question, where the popular resistance in Palestine and outside Palestine is going. I think we are going back to the roots. We're finding our roots back in the 1936 uprising and in the first Intifada, where the people were the most relevant component in all of this, and also going back to the South. Netanyahu has been traveling a lot in Africa and South America lately, and that is so shameful. That is not his domain, that's our domain. And we need to be fighting him over every inch of these places, because that's really where our real solidarity lies. Regarding the question regarding Arab governments, there is a major plot that is happening right now. A plot that attempts to sideline the Palestinians altogether. And it's a very dangerous one. Now, we know that Trump is a fool. I mean, he is not a politically savvy person and not someone with a long vision or anything. But the people around him, they are kind of either neocons or reincarnation of the neocons. And they always operate at this mega plan. They always have this thing. What they are trying to create, they are trying to normalize the relations between Israel and some Arab regimes at the expense of the Palestinians. And they are trying to redraw the map of the Middle East altogether. But they will fail. They will fail for one simple reason. When the Americans tried to do this after the Iraq War, 2003, if someone could remind me, it was the Project for the New American Century, yes? The Project for the New American Century kind of, it was an American trademark. This is our chance. We took over Iraq, we declare a new Middle East, we reshape and reframe the region and its powers in any way we find fit. And they failed. They completely and utterly failed. Not just they failed, they destabilized the region beyond their ability to put it back together. They opened all these new grounds for new players that are now there, Iran, Russia, and others. And even their own allies are now not united. The Jordanians are very wary of what the Saudis are trying to do. They're trying to push, because Jordan has this claim over Jerusalem, and the Saudis are going to be the new caretakers of Jerusalem, and the Jordanians are not happy, the Moroccans are not happy. So why would the Americans manage to push this scheme with their Arab allies now when they are at the weakest possible position compared to where they were in 2003? I don't think there's any chance of this ever happening. But I still think that there will be consequences to this. And I think the Palestinian Authority, I think the claim that the Palestinian Authority is on the verge of collapsing, I think there's a lot of truth to it. And the Palestinian Authority now would have to make a choice to either find a way to reclaim its position within the Palestinian people and find a new formulation to its existence, or to sell out entirely and completely and to join whatever American scheming they have in mind. So I still think that there will be some consequences, but it's not the kind of consequences that the Americans and the Israelis and the Saudis have in mind. There will not be a new Palestine, as Jared Kushner, is planning to declare sometime soon. What's that? Inshallah. Inshallah. And just one last point of what can we do. When I used to get asked this question many years ago, I always had a hard time answering. I always said, well, we have to educate ourselves on the subject, which we should do. We have to reach out to others, which we should do. But there was always this kind of lacking mechanism. But what does that really mean practically? How can we make a difference at that level? I think BDS, which is an essential tactic, I think we have to not mix between tactic and strategy. I think the strategy would have to come from the Palestinian people. It has to be a centralized strategy, and it has to have a very clear dynamics and mission to it. But it's an essential strategy, I think, and that is engaging the international community, harnessing all these energies, all the solidarity, all the support in a practical way for Palestine. It will also kind of answer a lot of the questions. For example, if you lived in a small town in Norway and you wanted to show solidarity for the Palestinian people, but it's not always possible, what do you do? Even the very act of going to a grocery store and making a decision that you are not going to engage Israeli products in itself is an act of solidarity. Somehow you became politically involved at some capacity, right? And when you write, when you get involved in a BDS group and connect and network with others through social media and so forth, you are also taking your part in ensuring that your city council, your local grocery store, your government are not being part of whatever Zionist agenda that they are trying to employ against the Palestinian people. Just one last thing about that, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what we are actually trying to achieve from BDS. For a long time, I think many activists, out of passion, out of love, out of solidarity, sometimes the roles were a little bit mixed up. You know, you had activists who are trying to tell us how to resist the Israelis. I wouldn't dare tell a Gazan how to resist Israel. You are living under this protracted siege, complete dehumanization, complete humiliation, and I am going to tell you, no, 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 there's this guy named Gandhi, and this is how he did it in India. It's belittling, and it's completely ignorant of the fact. What we actually need from you is what is being done by your name to cease being done. Because there's so much that is being done in your name. Wars are being fought in your name. Money, your taxes is collected and shipped to Israel in your name. Israeli tanks and military machines are growing and being subsidized in your name. Israel is making a lot of money because of the trade with the various countries, including this country, in your name. We believe that your fight is a local fight. Your fight is not Gaza. Gazans are very strong. They will withstand and they will eventually prevail. Your fight is here. Your fight is in Washington, in Seattle, in Johannesburg, in Rio, in all over the world. That's how we win these little fights, and together we create this massive global pressure that will eventually push Israel to listen. I do not think that solidarity from the outside will be enough and alone to reverse this. I think eventually it will be the Palestinian people who will liberate themselves the same way that South Africans have done it, Vietnamese, Algerians, and others. But international solidarity is absolutely essential component in this global fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr.